Thank you for joining us as we explore one of the most unsettling instances in American history. The story we're going to tell today took place in the dark mountains of North Carolina over a century ago. So before we begin, please leave a comment below where you are watching us. And no one has been able to adequately explain Nathaniel Burke's true fate to this day. The year is 1911. Modern civilization had just begun to spread throughout the Appalachian Mountains region. Soil. Roads wound between mist-covered hills and deep valleys. At that time, entire towns in North Carolina lived in isolation for weeks at a time, and the quiet of the woodlands concealed truths that would never be published in the major cities' media. It had its own unwritten norms and was a completely different universe. At the age of 32, Nathaniel Burke made the decision to leave Richmond, Virginia, in order to travel to the southern mountains. He was employed by a railroad corporation that intended to increase its lines. He was a photographer by trade, via Appalachia, an intelligent, careful man who documented his travels in great detail in his journal. His records were nearly scientific in their accuracy. He put everything in writing. Rock formations, temperatures, interactions with locals, and each stream he passed. Ironically, we now know that something terrible occurred in those mountains because of that behavior alone. Nathaniel left Asheville in March of that year with 3 weeks' worth of supplies. Madison County, more especially a secluded region close to the Shelton Laurel, is a hamlet renowned for its dangerous canyons and underground caverns. He planned to survey potential railroad routes, locate natural tunnels, and evaluate the terrain's stability. Nathaniel liked working alone, even though it was lonely. He had only employed one local guide, Ezra Whitlock, who was intimately familiar with every trail in the area. Nathaniel's diary states that the first several days went by as usual. March was chilly, he said, and the trees were still without. The sound of water pouring through the canyons was incessant, and the leaves were full. Despite his lack of communication skills, Ezra was a capable guide. They discovered an abandoned hut on a hill on the 5th day. Nathaniel observed that the location appeared to have been abandoned quickly. A saucepan was still on the burner, utensils were strewn all over the place, and garments were hanging and already decomposing from the dampness. Ezra was reluctant to enter. All he stated was that they should go on, since there were negative reports about that place. However, Nathaniel was a man of science. He was naturally curious. Ezra waited outside, clearly irritated, as he investigated the cabin. Nathaniel writes in the diary that he saw odd inscriptions on the interior walls. He explained that these marks were rudimentary symbols carved into the wood, creating patterns that I am unable to understand. These were the symbols he drew in his notebook. Although he did not specify what was in it, he also mentioned discovering a chamber concealed beneath the flooring. All he wrote was, "I found something that Ezra must. See? I think this cottage was not just abandoned." The diary's tone shifts after that. Nathaniel starts taking shorter, almost hurried notes. He notes that Ezra is acting suspiciously on the 6th day, asking that they descend from the mountains right away and continuously glancing back during their walks. Nathaniel maintained that the business anticipated results and that he still had work to do. If Nathaniel had written something in quote marks, Ezra would have responded, There are places in these mountains that wise men do not visit, and things that maps cannot depict. Something occurred on the 7th day. The record is disjointed and unclear. Nathaniel claims to have heard noises the night before, which he characterizes as voices emanating from the valley below, but they weren't typical voices. They sounded strange, like though they originated under the ground. Ezra had vanished before daybreak. His gun and food were still in the camp, but he wasn't there. No longer. Nathaniel looked around the camp, made calls, and followed trails all day. Nothing. Nathaniel made the fatal choice, alone now, as though Ezra had been engulfed by the jungle. He made the decision to continue instead of going straight downstairs to seek assistance. We don't know if it was fear of leaving a man who might be in pain elsewhere, professional stubbornness, or something more subtle that the diary doesn't make plain. However, he continued into even more isolated parts of Appalachia. His observations from the subsequent days describe hearing sounds he couldn't explain, discovering footprints that didn't make sense, and feeling like he was being watched. Nathaniel discovered another structure on the 10th day. He depicts it as a sort of stone shrine that was partially concealed by plants and constructed against the face of a cliff rather than a home. He discovered unsettling items within, including bones stacked in circles, stones stained with a dark substance, and more of those symbols engraved, now not just on wood, but cut straight into the rock. Nathaniel was starting to realize that he had discovered something far more than a straightforward mapping project. March 23, 1911, is the date of the last full diary entry. Nathaniel says that he has now made the decision to go back because he needs to inform the authorities about what he discovered, that something horrible has occurred in these mountains and might continue to occur. He talks about keeping minor items he gathered from the stone shrine as proof. He intends to descend early the following day, tracking a brook till he comes to the major thoroughfare. The entry then abruptly ends with a remark that is uncomfortable. Outside my tent, I hear footsteps. They're not animal-derived. 6 weeks later, a fur trapper named Thomas Hargrove discovered Nathaniel Burke's diaries while tracking deer trails in neighboring Madison County. While examining his traps, Thomas saw something out of the ordinary. Torn cloth fragments became lodged in prickly shrubs, creating a rough path that led to a little valley. Inquisitive and a little scared, he followed the traces until he discovered a leather backpack partially hidden beneath fallen branches and wet leaves. The diary, a few measuring devices, a partially finished map, and a tiny canvas bag filled with items Thomas would later describe to the sheriff as odd and completely nonsensical were all found within. Local officials initially handled the issue as a straightforward exploration accident when Thomas brought the diary to Marshall, the county seat of Madison. Men from the city, after all, who went into those mountains by themselves occasionally vanished. Errors were not forgiven in Appalachia. A fatal fall into a canyon could result from one mistake. Even the most seasoned explorers could get lost in an unexpected storm. The area was still home to many black bears. Usually, the most straightforward explanation was the right one. However, Sheriff Edmund Calloway, who retired to that peaceful county after serving as a federal marshal, was not content with straightforward justifications. He was. He read the entire diary, page by page, and was gravely troubled by what he discovered. His attention was drawn to the final entries, the ones that described deserted huts, odd symbols, and concealed stone constructions, not the technical observations on geography or train routes. Edmund was familiar with the highlands. In addition to having grown up there, he was familiar with the tales his elders told in hushed tones that the majority of people chose to ignore. 12 men, including Thomas Harrove, were assembled by Edmund to lead a search mission, them to the location of the backpack's discovery. On a misty May morning, when spring had already covered the mountains with thick foliage, they set out. Just getting to the general location mentioned in Nathaniel's journal took the gang 3 days. The paths were dangerous since they frequently vanished entirely beneath the undergrowth. Several times, men thought about quitting up and returning, but Edmund refused. He was troubled by something in that diary that he couldn't quite put his finger on. During the search's 4th day, they discovered Nathaniel Burke's first clear indication. The camp was half demolished and situated in a tiny clearing with dense pine trees surrounding it. The pegs were ripped from the ground as though something had yanked violently, yet the tent was still there, ripped in multiple places. Within a few meters of each other, kitchen equipment were dispersed. Loaded and leaning against a tree, Nathaniel's weapon never fired. Weeks of rain had drenched his extra clothing, which was half covered in moss. However, there was no body, no blood, and no obvious signs of combat. Only that moment of unexpected pandemonium. The men looked about the camp. About 50 yards away from the location, one of them, a farmer named William Jessup, discovered something unsettling. Footprints, but they weren't typical footprints. William summoned Edmund and the others to check. Although the imprints on the damp earth had a fundamental human shape, they were excessively huge, disproportionate, and the depth of the impression suggested a weight significantly higher than that of an average person. The footprints appeared to be far worse. Circled the camp multiple times, as though it had been watching for hours before acting. They were told to follow the tracks by Edmund. They followed the trail of marks down the mountain through an increasingly dense forest until they came to a small canyon where a stream flowed between boulders covered in lichen cover. And they discovered Nathaniel's second piece of gear, his tool belt, complete with all the instruments connected, in a creek bend where the water created a tiny, dark well, but the leather appeared to have been ripped by force. After examining the belt, one of the expedition's men, James Porter, who had fought in the fight against Spain years before, discreetly said that accidents or wild animals were not to blame for this type of damage. It was an intentional act that used a lot of force. Edmund decided what to do. More men, supplies, and, if feasible, a skilled tracker from outside the area were to be brought back to Marshall by half of the troop. The remaining half, which includes himself, would keep looking. They had to find something in those mountains, and every hour that went by made it harder for them to figure out what had actually happened to Nathaniel Burke and, it is assumed, to Ezra Whitlock. The men concurred, but it was obvious that some of them would have rather gone down completely. Everyone sensed a tension in the air that no one could adequately describe. Edmund and the other 6 guys returned to civilization. 5 carried on the hunt. According to Nathaniel's log, they camped next to flowing water multiple times, thus they followed the stream upstream. The terrain grew rougher and wilder as they went. There were elder trees, some of which had trunks so broad that 3 men couldn't give them a handshake. The dense canopy of leaves allowed very little sunlight to reach the ground. The stream's sound reverberated oddly between the valley's granite walls, producing a cacophony of watery whispers that seemed to appear simultaneously from every direction. The hunter who had discovered the original backpack, Thomas Harrove, was the first to notice it. On the route, he came to a sudden stop, held up his hand for stillness, and gestured to the face of a cliff that rose nearly vertically to their right. The others didn't realize what he had noticed for a few seconds. There was a building, partially obscured by bushes and vines that sprouted from the rock fissures. It wasn't organic. Stones had been purposefully stacked to create a low wall-like structure against the face of the cliff. The stone shrine was just as Nathaniel had described it in his journal. It was difficult to get there. Edmund was adamant, even though the men had to use jagged ledges and exposed roots to climb, running the risk of potentially lethal falls. Everyone fell silent for a considerable amount of time when they eventually arrived at the building. As Nathaniel had noted, the bones were arranged in circular patterns inside the tiny space, which was maybe 3 meters wide by 2 meters deep and formed a sort of man-made cave against the solid rock. They were. It was instantly apparent that they were not human bones. They came from a variety of creatures, including bears, deer, and what appeared to be a large cat. However, their arrangement was not at all natural. It had been purposefully made by someone or something. There were symbols all over the cave's walls. Edmund had spent his entire childhood in that area, mingling with the few Cherokee who were still living in the mountains, but they were not emblems of any native group that he was familiar with. These were distinct, possibly older, or entirely made up. Curves and straight lines blended together to create designs that were incomprehensible but appeared to have meaning. When he saw the symbols, one of the men, the Reverend Samuel Yates, a Methodist minister, mumbled a prayer in a low voice. According to him, it bore the stamp of something immoral that shouldn't be present in Christian countries. Edmund discovered something that chilled his blood in the middle of the grotto, partially hidden beneath a thin layer of dirt and dead leaves. It was a little book with pages and a dark leather binding. Moisture yellowed. He didn't already have Nathaniel's diary. This one was older and distinct. The handwriting was tight, erratic, and nearly frantic throughout the pages. The book appeared to have been written decades ago because of the outdated spelling, even though the material was in English, maybe even in the century before. In the weak light that came into the cave, Edmund carefully turned the pages, attempting to understand what was written there. He read something there that was never fully made public. Those who were with Edmund at the time, the 5 guys who saw his expression alter page after page, all eventually recounted the same thing. Edmund kept the book in his possession and only shared parts with a few state officials weeks later. The sheriff was clearly upset. His hands started to tremble a little. He abruptly closed the book, tucked it into his own rucksack, and gave the command for everyone to get down. He didn't explain himself. All he said was that they had to leave, of that location before dusk, but they were unable to. Even during the day, the descent was hazardous, and the sun was already starting to drop between the mountain tops. Edmund decided to set up camp at the foot of the cliff close to the stream. During the night, the men made a big fire, erected 2 tents, and alternated watching. Nobody had a good night's sleep. By the light of the campfire, Reverend Yates studied his Bible for hours, while silently moving his lips in prayer. Hargrove, Thomas, retained his firearm. Edmund just sat there staring at the flames, occasionally touching the rucksack where he had stored the enigmatic book, his gaze locked on the darkness outside the circle of light. William Jessup, who was on duty, roused everyone with an urgent whisper at around 3 a.m. Something had reached his ears. They were sounds emanating from the direction of the stone shrine above them, though he couldn't pinpoint what they were. Maybe something being dragged across the rocks, perhaps passos. The men were completely. They listened in silence, barely daring to breathe, trying to pick out any sound other than the fire crackling and the stream's steady murmur. It was stuffy and far away, but there was undoubtedly something heavy and moving up there that caused little boulder avalanches to roll down the canyon. Edmund grabbed his flashlight and pointed it at the precipice. For a minute, everyone swore they saw something, but the beam of light hardly made it to the height where the shrine sat. In one manner, there was a vague but unmistakable shadow standing on the edge of the stone structure, observing them. Then the form vanished too quickly to be natural. There was no sound, just a rearward movement into the cave's shadows. In some way, the ensuing silence was even more unsettling than the earlier noises. That night, nobody went back to sleep. The guys kept a wide circle of light surrounding the camp by feeding the fire until it burned with an almost agonizing intensity. Talking softly, they related tales they had heard about those mountains throughout the years. Tales of tourists who vanished from sight. Inexplicable noises reverberated through the valleys on moonless evenings, and entire settlements were abandoned one instant and then again, leaving behind houses brimming with possessions. Tales to frighten children, stories that had previously been dismissed as stupid superstition. But none of those stories looked so ridiculous there, beneath that cliff, that night. When the guys descended in nearly desperate hurry when it eventually rose, bringing with it the morning mist that always shrouded the Appalachian slopes. There was no more discussion on carrying out the search. They all agreed in silence that they had to leave the area. Leading the way, Edmund marched at a speed that made it difficult to stop. They returned to Marshall in 2 days, which was half as long as it had taken them to get there. They were filthy, worn out, and obviously shaken when they got to town, and they discovered the group that had. Along with 15 other volunteer guys and a reporter from the Asheville newspaper who had learned about the enigmatic case of the missing photographer, they had come down earlier to wait for them. Edmund declined to talk to the reporter right away. He started by going directly to the office of Albert Morrison, the county judge, a well-liked individual who was the top authority in the area. Edmund and the judge were trapped up together for 3 hours. Nobody is certain of the specific topics mentioned during that gathering. Judge Morrison, however, appeared just as upset as Edmund when they departed. He summoned an emergency conference with community leaders, the mayor, the senior preacher, the local doctor, and some influential landowners. That same evening, the meeting was held in the county courthouse behind closed doors. Following the meeting, a formal decision was made. A fresh expedition would be planned, but this time with trained men, sufficient money, and state approval. Finding a lost adventurer would not be an easy task. It would be a comprehensive study of that mountain region. Judge Morrison personally wrote a properly worded telegraph to Governor William Kyton of North Carolina, outlining the circumstances. He talked about the necessity to comprehend what was going on in that isolated area, the unsettling findings, and the disappearance of 2 individuals. That following evening, the telegraph was sent. 3 days later, the governor responded. He gave his approval for the mission and promised to send 10 troops from the assistance of a special investigator from the Capitol and the state militia. Henry Blackwood, the investigator in question, was well known for his ability to solve intricate cases involving rural crimes and disappearances. Henry brought cameras, forensic measurement tools, and even a crude sound recording device that he intended to use to record testimony when he arrived in Marshall on June 12, 111. Blackwood, Henry, was methodical. He spent a while before heading to the mountains, interviewing all parties involved for a whole week. He told Thomas Hargrove how and where he was able to locate Nathaniel's backpack. He questioned Edmund Calloway in great detail about what he had discovered and observed. In addition to taking thorough notes while reading Nathaniel's diary page by page, he requested to examine the enigmatic book that Edmund had discovered in the stone shrine. After a moment of hesitation, Edmund delivered. After bringing the book to his room at the nearby boarding house, Henry studied it for 2 nights. By lamplight. Henry's initial findings were both illuminating and unsettling when he eventually shared them. His investigation revealed that the ancient book seemed to be a kind of journal or record written by a people who had lived in those mountains decades before, perhaps in the early 19th century. The writings described rites, customs, and beliefs that did not align with any recognized religion or tradition. They were incomplete and frequently incoherent. In his report, Henry used the term cult, a solitary cult that had set up shop in the heart of Appalachia, far from the prying eyes of the outside world, engaging in practices he would rather not go into detail about in his official records. However, the final pages of Henry Blackwood's analysis were more unsettling than the old book's actual content. There, someone has taken more notes with a different, much more modern ink. The dates matched the final days noted in Nathaniel's journal, and the handwriting seemed rushed, almost desperate. Burke's journal. A few sentences were understandable to Henry. They remain here. The symbols are not decorations. They are warnings. Ezra fled because he knew. The fact that they aren't stories is the most unsettling of all. They are documents. Nathaniel's handwriting appeared on the final note, which appeared to be written with a shaking hand and simply said, "If anyone finds this, do not go up at night." In a private conference, Henry shared his findings with Sheriff Calloway and Judge Morrison. He put out a theory. That was logical, but it was also extremely disquing. There was evidence, according to Henry, that the most secluded parts of those mountains were still home to a small group of people who may have been descendants or continuators of that old cult. Over many generations, they would have created a culture quite apart from contemporary society. The stone shrine, the carved symbols, and the deserted cottage Nathaniel discovered all pointed to a clandestine society that purposefully remained hidden, regarding the destiny of. Henry acknowledged that he could only conjecture about Nathaniel Burke and Ezra Whitlock. When Nathaniel started investigating areas that were meant to remain unexplored, Ezra, who was local and possibly knew about ancient stories, would have understood the danger and run away. Or maybe he was related to the people who lived in the highlands, acting as a sort of protector who deterred inquisitive outsiders. Regarding Nathaniel, Henry thought he had discovered something that this clandestine society revered or prohibited. It was unclear what happened next, whether he was apprehended, killed, or just lost while attempting to flee. The last mission was scheduled for early July. The state militia's 10 members, Edmund Calloway, 5 local volunteers, Henry Blackwood and his 2 aides, and 7 porters hired to transport supplies and equipment totaled 25 men. In that area of North Carolina, it was the biggest search operation ever conducted. They brought weapons, climbing gear, supplies, and enough tents for 2 weeks. Photographs, and even explosives in case they had to battle their way through places that were obstructed by excessive foliage or landslides. On a bright, pleasant morning on July 6, 1911, the expedition departed. Half of Marshall's population turned out to see them go, some with a silent fear that showed up as worried glances and muttered blessings, others with the hope that they would finally receive answers. Before leaving, Henry Blackwood is reported to have been contacted by an elderly woman known locally as Mother Thornton, whispered in his ear, "The mountains hold what the mountains take. You won't find what you're looking for, but you'll find something." Henry recorded this as fascinating local folklore in his notebook. The first 5 days went by without any major occurrences, so don't give the words too much weight. Following the paths taken by Edmund and the others, the group first came to the location of Nathaniel's demolished camp, then to the gorge where the tool belt was discovered. Henry measured distances, took careful pictures of everything, and gathered samples of cloth and soil. He was compiling a comprehensive dossier that might be shown as convincing proof to state officials. The militia set up a fortified base camp close to the creek, with campfires burning all night and guards stationed in 4-hour shifts. With more men and proper equipment, they arrived at the cliff with the stone shrine on the 6th day. It was safer to climb. Henry headed upstairs, joined by 3 militia soldiers and Edmund. The shrine was just as they had left it weeks earlier. The circular patterns of the bones remained intact. No one had touched the symbols on the walls. However, something fresh was present. Now, there was another item in the middle of the grotto where Edmund had discovered the old book. It was the sketchbook Nathaniel had used to record the symbols he had seen in the first deserted hut. The notebook was open on a particular page that was purposefully placed to be seen. Additionally, a message in plain English was written in charcoal on the symbol design. Leave. Men debated the discovery right away. This, according to some, demonstrated that there were living people in those mountains who kept an eye on them, were aware of their existence, and wished to frighten them. Some, who were more anxious, advised them to heed the warning and leave right away. Keeping his composure, Henry examined the handwriting. In contrast to Nathaniel's more crude handwriting, created by a person who obviously lacked writing experience, his theory of an isolated community was strengthened by this. He made the decision that they would go ahead, but with more care. The number of night guards was increased from 2 to 4 per shift, and they were all told to keep their weapons ready and loaded. Established once more at the foot of the cliff that evening, nothing took place. There are no odd noises or shadows. The normalcy of the silence was almost oppressive. The males started to unwind. A little, with others even making the joke that maybe the warning had scared the person who left it. Edmund, however, was not persuaded. He was familiar enough with those mountains to know that complete silence was rarely a good thing. When nocturnal creatures remained utterly silent, it was typically due to the presence of a larger, potentially hazardous object. Henry split the group on the 8th day. In order to maintain a secure and defendable posture, half would stay at base camp. The remaining half, which includes. In expanding circles, he, Edmund, and the more seasoned militia members would search the area for other buildings, indications of life, or any hints as to where Nathaniel and Ezra may be. They would never go so far as to be unable to hear the signal shots in case something happened, and they would always follow in groups of at least 5 men. The most important discovery was made by Edmund's group, following a nearly undetectable hunting trail that went about 2 miles from base camp. They discovered obvious evidence of recent human settlement through an especially thick forest. It was a collection of makeshift shelters made of branches, leaves, and bark that were expertly disguised to blend in with their environment rather than a cabin or permanent building. There were remnants of ancient fires, boiling animal bones, and even some rudimentary stone and wood utensils. It had not been long since someone had been there. Edmund looked closely at the shelters. He calculated that they might hold 10 or 15 people. However, the arrangement of the place was the most unsettling aspect. The shelters were arranged in a semicircle, all facing the same location, a big, flat rock in the middle of the clearing, smeared with a dark substance that might have been old blood, though this could not be confirmed without more investigation. More of those symbols were carved into the earth surrounding the rock, created by the thoughtful placement of tiny white stones. Robert Lee, a 23-year-old soldier and the son of a Civil War veteran, discovered something. Concealed next to one of the shelters beneath a heap of leaves, it was a ripped piece of cloth that was still identifiable despite already being stained by time and humidity. Edmund's stomach clenched as he studied him. The railroad business that had recruited Nathaniel Burke described the material as being the same as the shirt he wore on his way out of Asheville. Professionals working outside favored this robust cotton fabric in a particular shade of navy blue. Without a question, Edmund gave the order for everyone to search for additional proof in that field. The guys dispersed over the area, searching every nook and cranny where something may be concealed, and they discovered more garment pieces, a brass button that might have been from Nathaniel's old coat, and even more revealing, a tiny pocket theodolite that was one of the measurement instruments on the photographer's equipment list. It was clearly a professional surveyor's tool, despite its condition and fractured lens. Nathaniel was. Sometime between his last diary post and now, he was there. However, there was no body, no human bones, and no clear indication of death. Only these meager pieces of possessions were strewn about as though they had been purposefully abandoned or left behind. After being summoned by signal gunfire, Henry Blackwood arrived at the scene 2 hours later. He stood silently for several minutes, observing and attempting to piece together what might have happened. His initial assessment was unsettling. Nathaniel Burke had been taken against his will to this location, which had functioned as a sort of ritual or judgment site. Henry gave the instruction to take a lot of pictures of the location. Every object discovered, every symbol, every refuge. In order to produce a record that could not be contested or written off as the product of superstitious men's imagination, he planned to capture everything with scientific accuracy. Henry walked about the clearing as Frederick Walsh, his primary helper, worked with the camera. He was a logical man who was skilled at coming up with logical explanations, taking measurements, taking notes, and drawing. However, he was unable to ignore the increasing feeling that they had discovered something far more than a straightforward offense. Back at base camp that night, Henry convened a conference of every man involved in the expedition. He revealed the measuring instrument, the pieces of clothes, the photographs that had already been taken with a small portable dark tent, and the results of the day. Then he posed a straightforward query. Were isolated communities in these mountains known to anyone there? Has anyone heard any particular tales of societies existing entirely apart from civilization? The local men looked at each other uneasily. There was no desire to talk first. Finally, the silence was broken by Reverend Yates. He related a tale about a tribe of people who had established in those mountains even before the Battle of Independence, which his own grandfather had told him decades earlier. They weren't indigenous, but they also weren't typical settlers. History claims that they were religious refugees from Europe. Individuals who were seeking a place where they could freely exercise their beliefs after fleeing persecution. However, according to the Reverend's grandpa, he did not hold Christian beliefs. They were something darker, something far older. And as the decades went by and they were cut off from the outer world, these people would have evolved into something other than fully human in their customs and conduct. Other men from the area affirmed that they had heard stories similar to that one. Some blamed it on Europeans, while others blamed it on settlers' descendants who had become insane due to seclusion. Although there were changes, the essence stayed the same. Deep in Appalachia, there was a group of people who purposefully avoided contact with the outside world and who responded violently when their privacy was violated. The majority of the local population merely stayed away from specific mountain regions, adhering to imperceptible boundaries that had, being transmitted through covert counsel and cautions from generation to generation. While taking notes on his notepad, Henry listened intently. When they were all finished, he sat quietly for a while, gathering his thoughts. Then he said something that shocked a lot of people in attendance. He thought that stories had a basis in reality. There was sufficient evidence to draw the conclusion that the mountains were continually or semi-permanently inhabited by some sort of human community. However, he also thought that this group consisted of actual people, not only demons or ghosts. If they were individuals, they could be located, confronted, and, if required, prosecuted for any crimes they may have done. The journey would go on, but Henry made additional regulations. In fewer than 8 men, nobody would deviate from the main group. Everybody would always be armed. At key locations, signal flames would be maintained to provide direction in the event that someone became lost. More significantly, unless it was absolutely necessary, they would not stay in the area after dark. They would return to base camp before dusk every day after finishing their excursion. Everyone acknowledged that it made sense and that it was a military procedure modified for the situation. The team methodically charted a 15-square-kilometer region surrounding the base camp over the course of the following few days. They discovered 3 other sets of makeshift shelters, all of which were obviously utilized but deserted. They found almost undetectable traces connecting these places in recent months, creating a network of routes that someone who knew. The region could be used to travel swiftly and covertly. Additionally, they found 2 naturally occurring caves with evidence of human habitation. Tool marks on the walls, ashes from old campfires, and even some crude paintings that looked like prehistoric rock art, but were obviously much more recent. There were scores of animal skulls hanging from stalactites near the mouth of one of these caverns. The darkest and deepest of the two, including those of deer, bears, coyotes, and even some that seemed to be household animals, such as pigs or goats. All of them were strung with vegetable fibers in patterns that resembled a macabre curtain, after being painstakingly cleaned and bleached over time. They were unmistakably a warning or demarcation of territory, a non-verbal but easily comprehensible statement. Someone owns this. Avoid it. Henry took a lot of pictures of the skulls. Along with Edmund and 4 soldiers carrying torches and lanterns, he also walked farther into the cave. The cavern may have been 50 meters, progressively lowering the ceiling until bending was required to proceed. Then they discovered an area that had been purposefully altered at the deepest point. The walls had been leveled with tools. The floor was level, and a raised platform made of stacked flat stones was there. More etched symbols were on the platform, and it was surrounded by concentric circles of tiny white stones that looked exactly like the ones they had seen in the shelter clearing. However, what attracted? What was in the middle of the platform received the most attention. It was something bound with tendon cords and wrapped in tanned leather. After hesitating, Henry touched it. There was a serious problem with the scene, something that made him doubt his logical assurance. However, he worked as an investigator, and investigators had to look into things. He unfolded the hide after carefully cutting the knots with his knife. There were human bones inside, parts of a skeleton but not the whole thing. A skull and both hands, with all of their tiny bones still, linked, as well as what seemed like a sternum. The bones had been cleaned, bleached, and coated with a material that gave them a nearly polished appearance. Edmund gave himself a blessing. The soldiers took a few steps back. Henry stayed on his knees and used his flashlight to study the bones. Despite not being a doctor, he had seen enough human bones at work to identify some traits. The robust form of the cranium suggested that it belonged to an adult, possibly male. On the right, there was an old fracture. There was something else, and the side of the skull, which had healed long before death. One of the symbols they had often seen was engraved right into the front bone using a delicate and accurate tool. The bone itself was permanently imprinted with the same pattern of entwined lines. Henry made the decision to return the bones to base camp after carefully wrapping them once more. This was vital evidence, maybe the most tangible indication they had discovered that grave crimes were being perpetrated in those mountains. However, it also brought up unsettling issues. The bones were old and obviously belonged to a person who had passed away years or maybe decades ago. They weren't Nathaniel Burke's. That was evident. Whose were they then? Over the years, how many more persons had vanished in that area without a thorough investigation? How many more sets of bones might be concealed in Appalachia's innumerable caverns and isolated valleys? Henry held another meeting when they got back to base camp that afternoon. He clarified the finding and his plan to halt the mission in 2 days. Not because he thought the mission was finished, but rather because he had gathered enough evidence to support a much larger operation, which would have required resources that he just did not have. He had to go back to Raleigh, prepare a suitable response, and disclose his findings to state and probably federal authorities. That may entail deploying dozens of men, possibly up to 100, to methodically search the whole mountainous area. However, not everyone supported Henry's choice. After being silent for the majority of the journey after discovering the warning at the stone shrine, Edmund Calloway eventually spoke his thoughts. He contended that delaying planning a larger expedition for weeks or months would allow the people who lived in those mountains to either entirely vanish or conceal all the evidence. With personnel and resources already in place, they now had a chance to identify the culprits and perhaps even discover Nathaniel's fate. Burke and Whitlock Ezra. If the two guys weren't already dead, waiting would mean leaving them to their fate. The debate continued for hours, growing increasingly contentious. Some men, particularly those who felt accountable for the disappearances and had personal ties to the area, backed Edmund. Others concurred with Henry, claiming that they lacked the necessary resources and manpower to take on a whole town that was infinitely more familiar with the area than they were. The Reverend Yates provided an alternative viewpoint, arguing that instead of confronting each other, they may try communicating, leaving messages promising peace and guarantees that their intents were not hostile. Nobody had given it any thought until Robert Lee, the young soldier who had discovered Nathaniel's first article of clothing, revealed something. He asked out loud if anyone had observed that over all those days spent investigating the area, they had only seen empty indicators of human presence rather than actual people. Printed notices, abandoned items, and shelters. It seemed as though the residents were always on guard, observing them and purposefully avoiding them. What was meant by that? Were they so few that they couldn't take a chance on conflict? Or were they so numerous that they could afford to just withdraw and bide their time till the invaders left? The group spent its final scheduled night in those mountains amid an environment of ambiguity and mounting tension, for which no one had an answer. Henry had, determined that despite Edmund's protests, they would return the following morning. As a governor-appointed special investigator, he had legal authority, and his judgment would be definitive. Despite his obvious hesitation, Edmund agreed to this. The men got ready for bed. Some were pleased to be leaving that location at last, while others were annoyed that they had no conclusive answers. However, the evening had different ideas. The night guards spotted something at midnight. Uncommon. Lights. Tiny, dim ones, like torches or flashlights that moved through the woodlands surrounding the camp. There were more than one or two. In the distance, dozens of them were advancing slowly toward the camp in a semicircle. The guards all awoke at once. The 25 men on the excursion were armed and on their feet in a matter of minutes, creating a protective perimeter around the tents and stoves. Henry shouted into the darkness using a megaphone he had packed specifically for communication scenarios. He gave his name. As a representative of the government of North Carolina, claimed they were merely looking for information about 2 missing guys and had no malicious intent. To ensure that no one would be hurt, he encouraged anyone outside to come closer so they could speak. As his voice reverberated through the valleys and bounced off the rock walls, it produced several layers of sound that eventually faded into the quiet of the night. No answer was given. The lights continued to move closer, slowly but steadily. Edmund proposed firing cautionary rounds into the air, a display of power to deter any assault. But Henry declined. They had no idea how many people were out there or what their true motivations were. They weren't certain they could win a fight that could be started with a single shot. Rather, he gave the command for everyone to wait while keeping their weapons ready and pointing downward to feed the fires until they blazed as intensely as possible. They wouldn't fire first, but they would protect themselves if they were assaulted. About 100 meters away, the light stopped, the camp's perimeter. They formed a ragged line that cut through the woods as they stood there still. The expedition's soldiers waited anxiously, their fingers on the triggers, and their eyes searching for patterns, numbers, or anything else that would give them a tactical edge in the darkness outside the fires. Hours elapsed in minutes. The only sounds were the controlled breathing of men ready for violence and the crackling of fire. Then a voice emerged from the shadows. It wasn't shouted, but it was carried in a way that made it obvious it had reached the camp. It seemed like a man speaking English with an oddly antiquated accent. as though he was using words and pronunciations from a different century. There was only one sentence spoken by the voice. "They've told you to go." The voice paused, then said, "The man of the city you are looking for is with his ancestors now." The guide who accompanied him had the wisdom to flee when there was still time. "There will be no more warnings." Then the lights went out just as suddenly as they had begun. Suddenly, everything was engulfed once more by the forest's darkness. Henry shouted once more for the person to return, to speak, to have some sort of accord, but he received no answer. Nothing further happened while the guys waited in defensive formation until dawn. Henry and Edmund led a reconnaissance mission to the location of the lights when it was finally light enough to see. They discovered a lot of tracks on the damp ground. Additionally, they discovered remnants of torches fashioned of cloth-wrapped branches that were soaked in flammable material and still had a hint of smoke, but no one was present. Only these slight remnants of his presence remained after whoever was there vanished entirely into the jungle. That following morning, the expedition came down from the highlands. The argument over staying was over. The situation had gotten too perilous, even Edmund acknowledged. A clear message had been sent to them. Since Nathaniel Burke was dead, they ought to depart as soon as possible. The inference from there was no mistaking the menace. They marched in close order for 2 days on their way back to Marshall, constantly on guard, but nothing pursued them. It seemed as though the people who lived in the heights just let them go once they started to descend. There was an immediate excitement when the group arrived at Marshall. Eager for news, half the city assembled to greet them, but the returning men's expressions did not portend good news. Henry Blackwood immediately proceeded to Judge Morrison's office, bringing. He gave him all the proof he had gathered, including the pictures, the meticulously wrapped human remains, the pieces of Nathaniel's clothes, and his thorough notes. He was accompanied by Edmund Calloway, who worked with him to produce a comprehensive report for state officials throughout the remainder of the day and the whole night. The report was a remarkable document that would eventually reach the capital and be entered into the official records of North Carolina. Henry made no effort to conceal or downplay what they had discovered. He explained the symbols, the shrines, the cave with the bones, the shelters, and the last night's confrontation. Their stated conclusion was that the most secluded parts of Madison County's Appalachian Mountains were home to a remote population, perhaps made up of descendants of marginalized or outlying religious organizations. This group had territory that it fiercely defended against invaders, engaged in rites that involved the use of human and animal remains, and was accountable for the disappearance of at least 2 individuals in Nathaniel Burke and Ezra Whitlock in modern times. Henry suggested a full-scale military action that might include federal forces in addition to the state militia, in order to carry out a systematic search that could actually find and confront individuals who lived in the mountains. He calculated that it would require at least 200 men, sufficient equipment for operations in hilly terrain, and several months of planning. Additionally, it recommended that anthropologists and physicians join the expedition in order to accurately record any discoveries and to treat anyone apprehended humanely, particularly if they were youngsters or others who would be detained against their will. Along with the most unsettling photos and a private note from Henry to Governor Kitchen outlining the severity of the issue, the report was delivered to Raleigh by express mail. It took 3 weeks to receive the response. It was quite disappointing when it did arrive. The governor acknowledged the seriousness of the results, congratulated Henry for his diligent effort, but said, he informed him that the state budget did not have the funds necessary for an operation of the recommended scale. It was not politically viable at the time to send hundreds of men and large sums of money to explore distant mountains because North Carolina was already struggling economically. Rather, because the body could not be recovered, the governor proposed that Nathaniel Burke's case be formally classified as an accidental expedition fatality with unknown circumstances. Since Ezra Whitlock was a local who reportedly left on his own initiative, there was no legal justification for continuing to look into his whereabouts. Although the governor admitted that there were likely isolated people living in those mountains, he emphasized that in theory, choosing to live apart from civilization was not illegal, as long as there was no unquestionable proof of violent crimes committed against particular, identifiable persons. The response infuriated Henry. He had put his life and other men's lives, had painstakingly recorded proof of illegal activities, and was now being informed that nothing would be done. He thought about bringing the situation to the public's attention, publishing his narrative in the media, and building public pressure to compel government action. However, he was cautioned against it by Judge Morrison, an older and wiser man. Making the case public might lead to the invasion of those mountains by bounty hunters and vigilantes, resulting in needless violence and possibly putting innocent people in peril. Communities residing close to the isolated locations. Henry reluctantly came to terms with the fact that there was nothing further he could accomplish via official methods. He spent 2 additional weeks in Marshall, speaking with elderly locals and gathering oral histories in an effort to gain a more comprehensive grasp of the area's past. He found something that was both intriguing and unsettling. A number of senior citizens recalled tales their grandparents had shared about the so-called people of the heights. There were unspoken guidelines that everyone adhered to, but they weren't regarded as harmful if left alone. Some valleys were avoided, some trails were not taken, and any indication that someone desired privacy was respected without inquiry. Henry found one very ancient woman, she must have been at least 80 years old, to be exceptionally illuminating. She recalled witnessing a group of people coming down from the mountains to trade in the city when she was younger, maybe about 1840. They carried objects made of exquisitely crafted wood, medicinal plants, and animal hides. Even for that era, they wore traditional clothing and spoke English with an odd accent. They exchanged goods and services swiftly, without ever speaking more than was required for transactions, and then vanished back into the mountains. When she was younger, this occurred once or twice a year, but it eventually decreased in frequency until it ceased completely. Henry penned every. Take care to write this down. I was starting to develop a more comprehensive theory. It's possible that these individuals weren't violent criminals by nature, but rather a group that had made the decision to live in total seclusion and responded defensively when their privacy was violated. When Nathaniel Burke explored his sacred or significant locations and gathered items from the stone shrine, he crossed a line that he shouldn't have, and his fate acted as a warning to others who might think about doing the same. It didn't justify what had occurred, but it provided a foundation for understanding and rationality. Regarding Ezra Whitlock, Henry never found out what his real purpose in life was. In Marshall and other nearby towns, the local guide simply vanished and was never seen again. There were 2 options. Either he had genuinely run away when he realized the danger and established a new life in a distant place, or he had somehow reconnected with the people who lived in the mountains. Henry had doubts about the latter. Ezra was also familiar with the trails. All right. He was aware of where not to go. He attempted to caution Nathaniel. Perhaps he lived on the edge of 2 worlds, acting as a middleman, and he just returned to the side where he truly belonged after the boundary was crossed. At the end of August 1911, Henry Blackwood departed Marshall. He went back to work as a special investigator at Raleigh, but for the remainder of his career, the Nathaniel Burke case plagued him. He painstakingly arranged all of his documents, photos, and notes in boxes that were eventually given to the state archives following his passing in 1938. These records, a silent chronicle of one of the most peculiar and unresolved cases in North Carolina history, are still there today and are accessible to any researcher who is interested enough to hunt them up. For 15 more years, Edmund Calloway served as Madison County's sheriff. He never again planned trips to those mountains. He actually turned into one of the strongest supporters of leaving some places unaltered. When youthful explorers or adventurers came to when with plans to chart isolated areas, Edmund adamantly dissuaded them, occasionally even inflating the area's natural hazards to deter them. He had witnessed something in those mountains that drastically altered his viewpoint. It was more than simply terror. It was a sort of grudging admiration for a set of people's desire to stay totally cut off from the contemporary world. There were sporadic more cases in the years after Nathaniel Burke's disappearance. A hunter who didn't. 2 college students who went missing on a trek in 1923 and were never located returned from an adventure in 1917. Edmund conducted some research each time, but he consistently reached the same conclusion. The mountains had taken people who had gone where they shouldn't have. He didn't bring up the remote village ever again. He maintained that information to himself, only disclosing it to dependable successors and those he believed should be aware of it for public safety. The railroad, the business that had employed Nathaniel Burke, ultimately abandoned its intentions to extend lines into that specific Appalachian region. Officially, the decision was supported by the terrain's difficulties and economic considerations. However, internal corporate records discovered by historians decades later indicate that Nathaniel's abduction and the concerning report Henry Blackwood disclosed in private to business executives were the true cause. Sending more personnel to a location was just not worth the risk, where their safety could not be guaranteed. As the rest of North Carolina entered the 20th century, the area remained basically stuck in time, lacking modern roads and railroad expansion. The tales of Nathaniel Burke and the events of that winter of 1911 progressively evolved into local folklore over the years. Some were entirely made up, some were exaggerated, and some details were lost. Nathaniel just got lost and perished from exposure, according to some. Others claimed that he was attacked by untamed creatures. Additionally, for those who were aware of the darkest versions of the tale, he had discovered secrets that the mountains zealously protected, and his curiosity had cost him dearly. The narrative was repeated slightly differently by each generation, but the essential elements were the same. Outsiders were not welcome in several areas of the mountains, and any who disregarded the warnings faced dire repercussions. In 1962, a private historical document collector purchased Nathaniel Burke's diary, which had eventually escaped Madison County's custody. Enticed by history, the collector attempted to plan his own journey to find the locations listed in the diary's pages. In the summer of 1964, he assembled a team of 6 guys who were all skilled explorers and mountaineers, and they spent 2 weeks in the mountains. Although the precise landmarks had changed over the course of more than 50 years, they were able to locate some of the basic regions Nathaniel had described. They were unable to find the stone shrine because landslides had changed the landscape and grass had grown over old buildings, or the bone-containing cave. Additionally, they discovered no evidence of recent human occupation. Everything seemed to have been absorbed back into the forest. However, there was a noteworthy event that occurred during that 1964 mission. The collector and his friends were camping in a valley near where they thought Nathaniel had set up camp for the last time when they heard something on the night before they descended. Henry Blackwood's expedition had heard something more subdued than the noises of conflict. Human corners. Through the mountains they could hear voices singing in a language none of them understood, coming from an unidentified source. After about 15 minutes, the boom faded into the quiet of the night. When they descended in the morning, they all decided to keep it to themselves. Perhaps it is better that way. However, the collector wrote in his own journal, "There is something alive in these mountains besides animals and trees, something old that chose to remain hidden. Almost every inch of the U.S. Earth's surface has been photographed and cataloged in recent years because to the development of satellite technology and digital mapping. Every now and then, inquisitive scholars analyze photos of Madison County's isolated areas for oddities, man-made structures, or any indication that Nathaniel Burke's account had a basis in actuality. Others report discovering odd rock formations, clearings that seem to have deliberate designs or even what might be routes or paths that connect regions that are inaccessible. However, satellite imaging is not always accurate. Shadows resemble buildings. Nobody truly knows what to look for in natural formations that imitate human design. In actuality, that part of Appalachia is still among the least developed and least populated in North Carolina. Modern humans seldom ever walk in some valleys, forests so thick that the earth is hardly exposed to sunlight, caves that have never been thoroughly studied or charted. It's simple to envision, so if they so desired, anything or someone may stay hidden there for generations. The mountains are enormous, and civilization, no matter how sophisticated it has become, still only inhabits the valleys and accessible edges, leaving the peaks mostly uninhabited. What was Nathaniel Burke's actual fate? Was he murdered by a remote tribe that saw his exploitation to be a defilement of holy places? Did he go lost and give up to the weather, and those who practiced finally found and ritualized his body? Customs that we don't comprehend? Or is there an entirely new answer that has eluded Edmund Callaway, Henry Blackwood, and all subsequent researchers? We still don't have conclusive answers over a century later. All we have are bits and pieces of evidence, eyewitness accounts, and that silent journal with its final, unnerving entry about nighttime footsteps. Something significant about the character of the United States in the early 20th century is brought to light by the Nathaniel Burke case. As, in actuality, there were still blank areas on the map, despite our desire to believe that the nation was fully charted, fully civilized, and fully understood at the time. Locations where the federal, state, or even local government's influence just did not extend far enough. Communities that led lives entirely distinct from the dominant national narrative, upholding their own customs, laws, and secrets with a zeal that would appear fanatical to outsiders. However, in terms of their own cultural logic, that made perfect sense. Looking back over more than a century, we can readily condemn those who let the case go unresolved. Why didn't the governor dispatch troops? What finally caused Edmund Callaway to give up searching? They lived in separate worlds with distinct priorities and ideas of what was acceptable and feasible. So why didn't Henry Blackwood insist more forcefully? Maybe they made choices that made sense in that situation. Or perhaps they just encountered something that exceeded their capacity for appropriate coping and opted for the easiest route. Despite the human dramas taking place on their slopes and valleys, the Appalachian Mountains remain as they have always been. There may yet be descendants of those Nathaniel Burke discovered someplace in those heights as trees grow, seasons shift, and streams continue to run over old rocks. Or perhaps not. Time and the unavoidable growth of contemporary society may finally caught up with them, and they either dispersed, blended in, or just stopped being a separate group. We're not sure. And maybe it's appropriate that we don't know. There are some mysteries that should stay that way. Certain stories should have mysterious, open-ended conclusions. We do know, however, that in March 1911, 32-year-old Richmond setographer Nathaniel Burke headed out to map routes through Appalachia and never came back. His journal has survived. They located his tools, pieces of his clothing, emerged in odd places, but the man himself is no longer there, engulfed by mountains that zealously guard their secrets like a closed vault. Additionally, he became a part of the unknown in his quest to map it. A tale whispered in the dark. A cautionary tale about the perils of over-inquisitiveness. A reminder that, despite the modern world, there are still some lines that we might not want to cross. This was the terrible tale of Nathaniel Burke, a man who looked far into the Appalachian Mountains and only discovered additional queries. Help us continue to uncover these lost tales if this case piqued your interest, or if the dark mountains and their long-forgotten mysteries captivated you. To ensure you don't miss our upcoming explorations of historical mysteries that time has attempted to obliterate, subscribe to the channel. If this trip through the North Carolina mountains has you captivated from beginning to end, please leave a like. Additionally, let us know in the comments if you think there are still spaces available. The United States, where remote settlements are totally cut off from the outside world. We value your thoughts and enjoy reading each and every remark.